All right, you guys are live.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. It occurs to me that this is our last Zoom event while we're on Mountain Standard Time. Well, actually, what happens is we stay on Mountain Standard Time all year long in Arizona, and everybody else shifts to daylight. But practically speaking, what that means is we're going to be on Pacific Daylight Time starting on Sunday. So, Peter, this is the hardest part of Zoom is time zones.
I know. I'm already confused. You just confused me. But yes, I'm here on Eastern Standard Time and it is dark.
That's right. Right. Whereas it's beautifully blazing afternoon in Phoenix right now. So anyway, I'm really delighted to see Peter, although I had truly hoped to see him live this year. So I'm not giving up hope that maybe next year he'll actually get here.
Next year, Barbara, I need to come back.
It would be lovely.
I love your bookstore and I love Scottsdale and what was the hotel I stayed at?
The Hotel Valley Ho.
Oh my God. I got to get back to Valley Ho.
Well, you really do. But what you really want to come back to is 72 degrees and sunny.
Yes, I want to. Well, it's funny is I went to LA last week for a little to see friends and a little vacation and all that. And we brought the snow and the cold with us. So I can't get away from it this year.
Well, it's been a bizarre winter, and we had that last year. John Sanford called me the other night to complain that he went down to the Tucson Festival of Books early to play golf and was snowed out for the entire time.
Wow.
They wished he had gone the week after, but it's just been wildly unpredictable, which is also true of Peter's books. So that leads me on a natural segue right here.
Yeah.
Peter's books. So for those of you who don't know Peter, let me just give you a little clue here. He's the New York Times bestselling author of 8 previous novels, including The Kind Worth Killing, which is in a way an antecedent to this book.
Yep.
He's the winner of the New England Society Book Award, a finalist for the British Crime Writers Association Ian Fleming Steel Dagger Award, which I think is a really cool award.
Yeah.
8 Perfect Murders is maybe the book that, do you think it got the most attention because of the crafty nature of your plot?
Yeah, I think in some ways it did. And I think also like booksellers loved it because it was about a bookseller and it was about books. So I think it got a lot of attention that way. I think in terms of like over time, Kind Worth Killing is the book that when I meet a fan, they say, oh, like Kind Worth Killing was the book that really got me into your book. So I think it's those 2 books I think are the ones that people talk to me about the most.
So, in fact, The Kind Worth Killing is this is, as far as I can remember so far, the only book where you've had repeat characters. Is that true?
Yeah, so it's my 9th book and my first sequel. So everything previous has been a standalone. Although I've had little, maybe I consider them part of the same universe because I've had little crossovers with characters. I'm calling Kind Worth Saving, for lack of a better word, a semi-sequel, in the sense that it doesn't pick up directly on the plot line of Kind Worth Killing, but it does pick up on 2 characters from Kind Worth Killing. One is Henry Kimball, who was a police detective in Kind Worth Killing, is now a private detective. And the other is Lily Kintner, who, depending on how you feel about her, is either a villain, an anti-hero, or maybe the hero. So I've heard all 3.
No, I know. I think, it's nice to have such ambiguity in a character and also ambiguity in her relationship with Henry, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
So it was really fun. I mean, I just knew that I wanted, I knew I wanted to return to them character-wise without necessarily, I didn't feel like there was more to say on the original story, but I kind of came up with an idea for another story and then found a way to put them into it. So I'd like to say, I think the book would be best if you've read Kind Worth Killing, but I think if you haven't read Kind Worth Killing, you would be able to follow this book and it tells its own story.
Well, that's true. I mean, as you say, it's kind of a sequel. It's not a direct sequel. And after all, people's lives have really changed. So talk to us about Henry, because you're right. He's had a real career change.
Yeah, so Henry, when we first met him in Kind Worth Killing as a police detective, but he's sort of an odd police detective. He's a little bit of a bookish guy. He really should have been a poet and not and not a detective. So in this story, we get two things about him. So we get where he's at now, which is he's lost his job as a Boston PD detective, and he's now a private detective. But we also learn a big chunk of his past history, which is at one point in time, he did want to be a poet, and he was an English teacher in a high school, and there was this sort of horrible event that happened in his classroom involving a gun and some violence. And one of the things that happened to him in that moment is he kind of froze. And it's haunted him ever since. And that's kind of what propelled him into the police, feeling like he had failed in that moment. So we find out where he's at now, and we find out that he has this past history. But this past history actually doesn't just come into the book as like it's more important to the book than you might know at first. So there's things that happened back then that reverberate into the story now, and that's where the story picks up.
In real life, there's been at least one police officer, I think it was in Texas, but I can't remember for sure, who did in fact kind of freeze. Maybe more than one officer in a school shooting. And that's a terrifying thing to have happen. Well, and also we've had that weird situation in Virginia where the 6-year-old brought a gun to school, and even though they sort of knew that he had the gun, or at least there was a rumor that he had a gun, and he'd been through somehow or other, he still had the gun in time to shoot his teacher.
People always ask, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, Barbara, but you're a mystery writer, and people are asked, like, do you have anything in your life you're drawing on? Do you have involvement in crime, or do you know anyone who's a criminal? And I'm like, no, I'm a writer. I live a very boring, placid life, though it's just the way I like it. But I always imagine that in the face of any kind of real danger, I would be a pure coward. I don't try and pretend that I wouldn't be. So I do empathize with the Henry situation, that he didn't move. And I've heard from other accounts that there's, in the face of someone pointing a gun at you or pointing a knife at you, like there's you go into a different mode of being where you're just frozen and like you cannot move. You're paralyzed with fear. So, and that's the type of characters I write. Like I'm not, I love a good Jack Reacher story, but I don't write those. I don't write about the person who is fearless in those situations.
Well, in real life, the argument is that, it's great to arm the populace so that anybody who's in a situation like that can pull out their gun and take care of it. But it doesn't work that way very often.
Yes, I mean, yes, I agree with that. I think for every maybe anecdotal story about some good person with a gun, it's probably someone gets hurt innocently with a gun in the house. I mean, this was funny. I've been doing a little traveling, so I've just come back from LA, and now in the airports they always tell you, you see the sign, especially in certain parts of the country, like, don't forget you can't travel with a gun. And I read this story recently that about 100 people per day have a gun pulled out of their bag at TSA, and it's not that they're trying to fly with their gun, it's that they've forgotten they have a gun in their bag, which I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I would hope that if you have a gun, you wouldn't forget.
Unfortunately, I think that people are way too casual. Many people are way too casual about it. In the same way, now that marijuana is legal, there's a big uptick in children, running across their parents' stash and, ingesting
well, their
it.
parents' stash looks like candy.
Well, I mean, it's candy. It is. It's gummies, so who can blame?
They're very popular, the edibles. Yeah, I do think it's a little, yeah. So I think there's a lot of ER visits with little kids who've eaten like a handful of gummy bears.
Even dogs. Apparently, there have been.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yep, puppy poisonings too. But my point is that people become accustomed to dangerous substances, whether it's a gun or whether it's a gummy bear around children, and as a result, there's a big uptick in things that can go wrong. And the truth is, if a person with a gun is not actually trained to use it and is in a dangerous situation, they're just as likely to kill a bystander as they are, or shoot a bystander as a person. Anyway, so Mr. Kimball here joins the police. What propels him out of the police into being a private eye?
Well, so this is what's happened in the Kindworth killing, and if you haven't read
You
it,
don't want to spoil it, right?
we don't want to spoil it too much, but the events of that book mean he gets kicked out of the police.
Okay.
And he has a run-in with Lily, and those two characters are the characters that I've sort of brought back together in this book. Mostly because I just like writing them, and particularly Lily, who is, like I said, and it's no spoiler to say she is a murderer, because we find out in second chapter of Kindworth Killing that she's killed her first person at the age of 13. She is not so much a serial killer as someone who I think doesn't mind killing people. So I think of her that way, like she's not bothered by it, and if someone's sort of threatening her, she's willing to get rid of them. So she's kind of a fun character, right, for that reason.
So she's sort of a disposal unit more than she is.
I think of her as that way. I think, right. I mean, she's trying to mind her own business in her life. She's not out to kill a bunch of people, but she's also has a strange sense of morality. I mean, I guess what you would say is that has sociopathic tendencies, that killing a person to her is the equivalent of, say, swatting a fly, especially if she doesn't have a high opinion of that person. So as a writer, that kind of character is fun because they don't have moral boundaries. So you can really have them do, all sorts of interesting stuff.
So she'd be kind of a person interested in the Darwin Award, cleansing the gene pool.
Yeah, she's not impressed with the human race in general, I would say.
Right. We're going to do an event after your event at the store tonight with Rupert Holmes, whose book is called Murder Your Employer. And the thesis of it is that, there are people that are making your life intolerable, and even worse, maybe making other people's lives intolerable. And so it's a handy handbook about how to, so Lily would love it. It's a handy handbook about, how to get rid of these obnoxious people and make the world a better place, right?
Right. I mean, I think there's a number of this sort of character coming, that are popular in books. I think the casual killer, the convenient killer, because I do think it strikes a note with all of us that wouldn't life be easier if we could just snap our fingers and make certain annoying people disappear?
Yes.
And so it has that element of like fantasy, but it's a little more complicated than that, I would believe, in real life. But I haven't heard of this Rupert Holmes book, but I'll check it out.
Yeah, well, over the last few years, I have to admit that if I'd had that super ability, I probably would have deployed it. So who can say? Anyway, one of the things I find really interesting about the Kindworth killing is that there are multiple points of view.
Yeah.
So Henry is a point of view, Lily is a point of view character, but there is a character called Joan, who in many ways is the heart of this book.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, Peter, that you're really interested in the idea of somebody, the sort of adrenaline rush thing, that somebody does something that produces so much dopamine or whatever that they're bored by everything else and have to keep returning to it, which you hear about a lot with professional soldiers or people who've been in combat and all. But you've got Joan as a bored teenager in a kind of crummy resort with time on her hands and not enjoying her family and whatever, and that's where this book really takes off.
Yeah, so the original spark of this book started with these teenage characters at a resort before I ever put Henry and Lily involved in the story. I won't go into details, but I had stayed at I was doing a favor for a friend and dropping off some of his kids at summer camp in Maine. and then picking them up. And in the meantime, I stayed at this old resort hotel, which will remain nameless, that was like this kind of once classic hotel that was now run down.
Right.
But they still did the big buffet dinner. They had a very old clientele because I think it was cheap. But it was just on its way out. It was not the greatest place. And I saw like a couple teenagers there who looked, of course, like they'd been sentenced to a prisoner of war camp for the week by whoever had brought them there. And so I just started musing on this idea of a kind of boring resort where two teenagers would meet who wouldn't normally be friends in real life. And that's the case with this story. Joan is a very popular high school girl. She's a star gymnast. She's maybe a little bit of a mean girl. Richard goes to her school as well. They've never spoken, and he is kind of a classic recluse, bookish, keeps to himself. They meet at this resort. They, of course, recognize one another, and they form this friendship, partly because they have a mutual enemy. And it's also a secret friendship, but something about the two of them coming together without a lot of adult supervision, kind of like their bad influence on one another. And what they get up to at that resort is the sort of first murderous sequence in the book. And then they go on to maintain a friendship over the years in secret. And you're right. I think Joan is someone who she always remembers this. Yeah, she needs something going on in her life, some sort of action or whatever. And Richard's just kind of along for the ride in his own way. So that's the story I wanted to tell. And whenever I'm thinking of a story, I'm thinking, can this be a novel?
Yeah.
Is this a short story? Is this a novella? Can I get a whole book out of this? And the point at which I realized that I could pull Henry and Lily into the story was the point at which I was able to say, oh yeah, I think this is a novel, and I can pull a whole story out of it.
Well, it's a complex story, as again, with a number of characters. Who's Richard?
Richard is, I mean, what's interesting is I think there are a lot of Richards in the world. He is a loner. He lives in a fantasy world. He feels unseen. He's smart, but socially inept. I think we all had that kid in high school, and now we think of, warning signs on gun violence or kids who might snap. And I'm not sure he would have done bad things had he not met Joan, who
Right.
sort of spurred him. So I think, teenagers, that's a tough time, and if you don't have a good home life, or bad things can happen. I always think of Stephen King. I don't know if you remember this, but his first novel that he wrote, which was later published under Richard Bachman's name, was called Rage, and it was about a teenage boy in high school who takes his class hostage with a gun. It was very sort of prescient at the time because these sort of events hadn't happened when he first wrote this, which is the early 70s. But that's who he was. He was an awkward bookish nerd, and he got bullied in high school. And I often think, because he was able to write that book about that meant it never happened in reality. He found a different outlet for it, for whatever rage that he felt as a teenager, and then went on to have this, obviously amazing career as a writer. But it could have gone a different way, right? I mean, I think that there's a tipping point. So I think of Richard as one of those people on the tipping point, and meeting Joan was probably an exciting thing for him and a bad thing for the future of his happy life.
There are a lot of cases, real life cases about, I think it's called folie à deux, basically,
Yeah.
which is a French term for madness that basically takes two people.
Yeah.
And, you can look back at Myra Hindley and whoever, I can't remember who her partner was, the twin serial killers
Yeah.
in England, or isn't it Charles Starkweather? And I can't think of the name of the woman that was involved with him, but it seems that, that if it's an unfortunate collision of two different characters, one of whom is usually more dominant than the other, and sucks this other person into the orbit, but they enable each other or spur each other on in ways that if left to themselves, they probably wouldn't. But it also can take, and I think you do this well in your book, kids in high school are so vulnerable and nobody really knows how to cope with a bully.
Yeah.
And I don't, as grown-ups, I think it's hard for us to remember back about just how defenseless kids who are just forming their personalities and are so vulnerable. And a bully can just be like an atom bomb in their lives.
Sure. Yeah, I think it is a really vulnerable time. What you said about Folio Do is so interesting, because I've been thinking a lot about that, partly because of my book, but also partly because I just wrote a piece for The Guardian on criminal duos in fiction. There's less of them than you'd think. The other example would be Leopold and Loeb, the
Yep.
two college students in the 1920s. And there was a novel written about them called Compulsion. But I love this idea of two people coming together, and right, they're more dangerous together. They spur each other on. I mean,
Absolutely true with Leopold and Loeb. I mean, it really was a thrill kill. But there's also a certain element of being convinced they can get away with it. A relative of my husband was the intended target for Leopold and Loeb.
Oh wow!
He got sick and didn't go to school on the day that they decided to act. So that the boy was killed was actually not the original target.
Oh my God!
It happened in Chicago,
Right.
and among the Jewish community in Chicago,
Yeah.
and that's reverberated in the Rosenwald family for years, thinking about how this child, it's kind of like the person that didn't get on the plane because work called or something, and then the plane went down. How we can be just a tiny act away from some calamity that we have avoided, not through any merit.
A younger boy
Just,
in their community. Yeah. They killed a younger boy in their community, right?
it was a school thing, yeah. And instead of the boy they had decided they could get away with killing, they picked on a younger one because, as I said, the older one stayed home sick that day, not from any knowledge that he was targeted or anything. He just happened to get sick.
Right.
And but it definitely was a thrill kill that these two kids, and we know about Anne Perry and her her friend.
I was going to bring that up. That made the movie called Heavenly Creatures, but yes, Anne Perry.
Right, and that, I don't know exactly how one can characterize that. It wasn't a thrill kill. They wanted to do something and decided they wanted to travel together to when one of their fathers was being relocated to a different continent from New Zealand to South Africa, and felt that the mother, the woman they eventually killed, was in their way, and if they could just remove her. But then there was kind of a frenzy that clearly occurred in the actual act, because I think this woman was hit something like 48 times with a brick. I mean, it was a really ugly killing once it got started.
That's a good example of, obviously, one of them has gone on to have a productive life, and there is a sort of madness that can take over.
Right.
And I
It's
do
the
think
folie à deux, as I said.
right. And they had a really rich fantasy life, the two of them, where they sort of imagined they were almost sort of like they weren't in reality when they were together. They were in a kind of weird fantasy life. beyond
Well,
reality.
I think that's true. I think that does happen, that they kind of go into an altered state where somehow
Sure.
they imagine that they can do these acts and not get caught. But the instigating incident was the threat of separation. Whereas in your book, the bully, is the thing that
Yeah.
a desire to,
And the thrill of doing something morally transgressive, I think, is at that age, can we get away with this? And also maybe the feeling at that age that you will get away with this, that in the same way at that age you feel like you'll never grow old. I mean, there's a sort of immortality, indestructible feeling among some teenagers. I'm not sure I had it myself, but yeah, that is pretty common.
I think about, we have had to have a dog that was part of our staff, so to speak, came to work and all, and he had to be put down, and it was really hard on his first time pet owner. But I reminded him that animals, dogs at least, but I think all animals, don't really have any sense of immortality.
Yeah, I don't think so.
They don't know when you're
Mortality, right?
right. They don't know that, or sense, yeah, right, of mortality, I should say. So they don't know that, that last trip to the vet or whatever it is,
Right.
how it's going to end. So they may be frightened by being in a strange place, but they're not frightened at the prospect of dying because they don't really understand it. And I think that's very true of teenagers. And remember Audie Murphy, the incredibly decorated World War II. He was a kid. He was like 17 or 18 and probably never even imagined that he could be killed.
There was no fear, right?
Yeah, which or sense of fear, which I think is a major thing. I can't find it, but you had a line in the book somewhere where Joan actually says that she, her regular life is boring and she can't really move beyond the idea of recreating the thrill.
I think
I'm not saying it well.
yeah, I think she talks about and she has a little, so there's a couple things going on with Joan. One is she feels overshadowed because she has a sister who had childhood leukemia, that took away attention from her. She has an event where early in her life she hides from her parents in the closet in their house to sort of make her parents pay for not paying attention to her. And she falls asleep in there, and the parents can't find her and call the police. And eventually they find her in this closet, and she remembers, it's this sort of crucial moment for her where she's like, she feels incredibly seen, and she feels the excitement of everyone being so happy she's alive, and she feels the sort of glow of people looking on her. So she's repeatedly seeking out that feeling again and again, but she gets it in these pretty transgressive ways. So I do think she was interesting that way. She kind of escalates as the book goes on. She gets kind of worse and worse. But yeah, I think it's just this need to right. She's bored by regular life, by comfortable life. And
Yeah.
she's always, she's looking for a certain kind of attention.
So how did Joan and Henry come together? Because it's a professional transaction at the beginning.
Yeah,
And
so
no, it isn't. It is now a professional one, but they did have an earlier connection.
so the book, this is my 9th book, and it's my first book with really a private detective as a major character. And I thought, I got to open this book the way all private detective novels should open, which is a client walks into an office.
Right.
And so that's how I opened the book. Henry's in his office, and in walks Joan. She's an adult now, with a pretty simple case, which is she's hoping he'll trail her husband to discover that he's having an affair. But of course, when she walks in, she says, I know you already because you were my teacher in high school, many years ago, not that many years ago, but 15 years ago or something like that. And that, of course, brings up the high school memories that Henry has. And he takes on this case, and it seems like a simple case, to trail her husband, but it's sort of anything but. And that's what reintroduces Joan into Henry's orbit, and makes him begin to wonder if there's more sinister intent with what's going on with her. And at the same time, he's remembering what she had been like in high school and going back to that time. And it all kind of ties together.
Well, it's an interesting story structure because you have to go back in time and then you have to move the present time forward. So did you have to sort of map that out so you didn't mess it up?
I do a little mapping. Sometimes I do the mapping post book and then find out I did mess it up and I have to go back and fix it. I'm not one of those people with notes, sticky notes on my wall with every little plot point. But yeah, as I go along, I kind of put it down. And then sometimes what I'll do is I'll open up a document and start putting in dates of when things happen, what year, to know the exact year they were at the resort, how old they were, and try and get all that straight, to save my eventual copy editor the misery of discovering that my book doesn't work, which has happened in the past. I mean, you can always fix it, but you don't want to make them too unhappy.
No, but you do like complicated plots and complicated plot structures. So it is a lot more work than, many PI stories are pretty straightforward. They start with, as you say, the client coming in the door, and then they just kind of move along.
Yeah.
But your stories don't work that way. How did you like having a private eye as your lead?
I love it because it's a great way to start a book. I mean, you want to get into it, right? So I always love that. It's a client, it's a detective. You need to find something out. Often it feels like something simple. And of course, private eye novels, a little bit like whodunits too, but in a different way, are interesting things because they move forward, right? The private detective begins interviewing people or stirring up things or following people. And as the detective moves along, what we find out is more and more of what's already happened. So we find out about the past. Not always, but often.
Right.
And then, I'm thinking in particular, like in a Ross McDonald, it's often like a family dynamic that winds up being like incredibly complex and filled with trauma. It blossoms. In other words, what looks like a small problem becomes a big deal, and it's part of a bigger picture. So I love that idea, and I also, private detectives are nice and simple as detectives go. They don't have to follow all the police rules. They don't have to report. They don't have to do all the paper. You don't have to like do it in the exact police way that things are done. They're a little more free to lie to get what they want, to break into places. There's a lot of freedom with them. There's a reason they are a popular fictional character, I would say.
Many studies, and my own belief is that the private detective really sort of sprung out of the Western hero, when the frontier closed. And I mean, it's not coincidence that Hammett and Chandler and so forth were in California at the end of the frontier and wanted to write about that kind of, John Wayne hero, or, Alan Ladd and Shane, the guy who comes into town and cleans it up and whose loyalty is really not to the law or not to the state. The loyalty is really to the person in trouble they've been hired to help or want to help. Yeah, I mean, really, you mentioned Reacher earlier. I mean, Reacher is Shane, in modern form. He gets on a bus, he rides into town, romances the girl, cleans up the town, and then he rides away. While the little kid in the background, Brandon Willis, Shane,
Just doesn't have a horse, he has a bus, right?
Yeah, I mean, and it's so supremely ironic that it's a British author writing the quintessential American Western. So, but anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think the private detective novel, as you say, it's more, you can be freer in the way the investigation goes if you're not constrained by the police department and all. But on the other hand, very few people become private detectives just out of the blue with no kind of training. Many of
Right.
them, in fact, are former police officers or perhaps former military or something. But I mean, they do need a skill set that the average person doesn't acquire. And today they really need to be licensed. You know, I mean, if they're going to hang out a shingle and say, hey, I'm a private detective, you can't just do that on a whim.
And I think in reality today, what a lot of private detective agencies do is it's a lot of background checks for corporations. I mean, you're really just it's a lot of employee. I have a friend of a friend kind of who's a detective, and that's what he spends his day doing. He's not out trailing you know, interesting blondes around San Francisco like
That's
Timothy.
true. Well, some of them are hired by lawyers to do investigating, defense attorneys, not
Yeah.
prosecutors. And then they become part of the defense attorney team and they get, you know, attorney
It's a lot of that. It's a lot of
privilege. Yeah, you see all of that. In here in Arizona, when so many people have moved in and nobody knows who their background is, a lot of times it's personal checks. And I think the rise of dating apps has really probably fostered a fair amount of private detective work, because you meet somebody on, you know, Tinder or something, you don't have any idea who they really are. And so
that's interesting. That's there's an interesting book to be written there too about dating apps and how you don't know. You don't know who's
no. I mean, it's all the way from pedophiles luring kids to, you know, I mean, it's a hunting ground, let's face it. So I mean, there are lots of things that private detectives can do, but using shoe leather is probably less, you know, the old Robert Parker or Ross McDonald, for that matter, with Lou Archer, is not as prevalent today as you might think. But you know, the classic private detective, with possible exception of Lou Archer, who was actually kind of always in the background. What was it that Ross McDonald said something about Lou Archer, like if he turned sideways, you couldn't even see him in the book? You know, he was more just a kind of agent for telling the story. But in so many private investigator novels, there's a certain amount of damage in the investigator, you know, to make him more interesting. I mean, he can be, you know, he could be an alcoholic. He can, I mean, you know, so with Henry, he does have, in fact, this background that you gave him in The Kind Worth Killing. No, I'm sorry. Yeah, in The Kind Worth Killing, as opposed to The Kind Worth Saving. I keep screwing up these titles. I'm really sorry.
Okay. No, that's fine. They do share 3 out of their 4 words, so yeah.
But anyway, so Henry falls into that sort of classic mode, right? That, you know, he has a checkered career that has brought him to hanging out his shingle and being a private eye, not notably successful.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, some private eye firms are like law firms, you know, I mean, they have multiple offices and they have multiple employees and, you know.
It's like a big corporation, right? He's more the old school, like a small corner office. Spencer, of course, is, you know, I grew up in Massachusetts. My mom read the Robert Parker Spencer novels when I was young, and I started reading them young, and I love them because, well, 1, they're great books, and 2, they were sort of in my neighborhood, and I loved reading about them. But he was I mean, he was sort of the classic, just a tiny office and a client would come in, and you know, he had some baggage, but he was the knight, right? He was the moral knight who, regardless of who had hired him, would in the end try and do the right thing.
Absolutely. Now, Spencer's more in that, you know, Western hero mold. But, you know, back in the 90s, Peter, before you got into this, but I opened the store the Poison Pen in 1989. So I got to ride the whole wave, which is when the woman private investigator took over. The woman sleuth movement was
The Irish
in the 90s.
Sarah Paretsky,
Sue Grafton, Marsha Jan Burke. There was just a whole raft of women who wrote, and part of it, I think, was because there were fewer women as active serving police officers in the murder squad. There were women in the police, but they weren't necessarily on the really dangerous runs. And so if you had a private eye, a woman as an investigator, you could, put her into all those situations. But what I thought got a little tiresome wasn't true of Kinsey, and not really of V.I. Warshawski, but many of them, because they're always clones in a really big genre, wound up having, cops or similar as boyfriends, because private investigators don't have a power of arrest. So if you really want, some guy to work a case and eventually bring someone to justice, they can't do it.
Right. You can't have that big moment. Right.
No, you can't. And, people don't think about this, but in the golden age, Lord Peter Wimsey could afford to investigate on his own because he was, son of a duke and he had a lot of money. But everybody sort of forgets that his brother-in-law, Henry Parker, was the actual cop.
Right. Just
like Miss Marple's nephew was the actual cop. Or we had Lestrade for Sherlock Holmes, or, we had, I'm trying to remember some of anyway, even in the golden age, when you had so many private sleuths, they had some kind of basically on call. Yeah, exactly. And so you do have to sort of make that bridge if you're expecting your private eye to see the case through and wind up arresting the criminal. So do you find that that's something you can avoid or something you're working towards?
Well, this book takes different turns, and it's interesting. If I thought of, and I'm not sure kind of what I'm going to do next, but I mean, if I were to make Henry, for instance, a recurring character, I think he does have a connection back in the Boston PD, and her name is Roberta James. She's briefly mentioned in this book. We talked at the very beginning of this talk about how I'd never really written a sequel, which is true. I do, however, Roberta James, that detective, is in my first book, Girl with a Clock for a Heart. She's in Kind Worth Killing. She's in Her Every Fear, my third book. And she's briefly mentioned in this. So he would have someone who he can call on, either to make an arrest or call on to just help him out with information. So he does have that connection. Because you're right, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but I knew that she was important at one point in this book, that he would make a call to her. So it makes sense.
That's how it works. It really does. I mean, a repeating private eye probably is more realistic than a repeating bookseller.
Yeah. It's easier to get them in. I mean, obviously, other writers have done it with amateur sleuths. I mean, we all know Miss Marple. Just if she goes to visit someone for the weekend, it's not going to end well. But and you just accept that as a reader, that certain amateur sleuths are always stumbling upon a crime, but it's not always realistic.
No, it's not realistic. At least she traveled around. The most unrealistic amateur sleuth ones are the ones where they live in a small town on the banks of Lake Huron and support themselves with a chocolate shop or something.
People die in their town like every 3 weeks, right?
Yeah. Miss Marple was mobile. And in fact, I'm going to put in a plug here. There's a fabulous collection called Marple of modern crime writers who have updated Miss Marple. They have given her, Jane Marple, they have actually given her roles.
I have that book somewhere. I'm looking around.
You know what? Read it. It really is wonderful. And one of those surprising ones is the success with which, I can't remember which author in it, brings Miss Marple to New York. I mean, you would not think it would work, but it absolutely does.
I'm trying to think. So in the original Christie's, the one international one I know for sure is the Caribbean Mystery. She goes to the, I think a sort of a fake island, probably Jamaica, based on Jamaica, but and solves a crime there. But there is one in New York in that story.
There is. It's really a super book. It made the bestseller list, which is very rare for any kind of story collection or anthology.
Sure.
You almost never see that happen, but it really deserved it. So if you're thinking about more private eye things, I highly recommend you read Marple first and see the rich diversity of forms that a private eye novel can take.
That was a great idea for that anthology.
Yes, it
They got,
was.
they got some good writers for that too. Yeah.
Very good writers. So let's call Jacob up and see if there are any comments from watchers that he has to appear on the screen. Meantime, I will say that Peter has thoughtfully signed many copies of The Kind We're Saving, which we now have on sale at the Poison Pen. It's not too late to order one. So,
Right.
Jacob.
Hey, Peter. There are a few questions from Facebook and YouTube. The first one comes from Fred. Hello, Peter. I was wondering if you had any writers that really inspired you, and who do you like to read?
I'll do the sort of the older sort of last century writers, which is where I really get most of my inspiration. One is Ruth Rendell, who kind of she wrote a lot of books. English writer, died about 10 years ago, I think. She really moved between whodunits and psychological thrillers, and she often merged them. I think she does twisted, dark characters really well, while at the same time, like, being right within the world of like a classic whodunit with clues and all that. And she's just someone I go back to quite a bit. I don't think I've ever read, I have my favorites of hers, of course, but I don't think I've read a bad book by her. So I love her. These days, I'm enjoying Anthony Horowitz's sort of fun classic whodunits, both the Magpie Murder series and then the series where he inserts himself as a sort of bungling crime solver. I'm really enjoying, like, I mean, they're quite light, kind of comic capers, but they work really well. And he's always been good at writing a mystery. So I enjoy those a lot.
Now, Foils War, in my opinion, it's not a book, but I think Foils War is some of the best television ever going. And I have
Absolutely.
enormous respect for Anthony Horowitz's many creative ventures. I mean, he's really been extraordinary.
I just wonder if he sleeps, because I mean, he's just so prolific, and I think he wrote every Foils War episode, which to me, I mean, those are some really good mysteries on a weekly basis. I mean, just really good stuff, but a great show. I'm sure most
Yes,
people
it holds
watch
up.
it.
I think I watched it 3 times, but let's not forget Midsummer Murders. He wrote,
I know he started that too.
and
Yeah,
he
yeah,
wrote at least 2 or 3, maybe more. He wrote the scripts.
yeah.
And he's written children's books, he's written a James Bond book, he's written, you're right, incredibly.
He's very
I think he
good.
also has a very low boredom threshold because, otherwise, I mean, he's not one to write the same thing, he likes,
No, he's good. He's very good at writing like homages, like his James Bond books. What's amazing about them is they might as well have been written by Ian Fleming. They're very authentic feeling. He's very good at that. And he did a couple Sherlock Holmes as well. One called Moriarty and one called House of Silk, I think. And those are both there.
Was House of Silk. That's the only time he actually has ever come to visit the store in person, was with House of Silk. And, I had a hard time, keeping my chin up from, being so odd. It was difficult to manage, but nonetheless.
Yeah, he's great.
Wonderful guy. All right, Jacob, another question.
All right. Do you perhaps have a favorite of all of the books you've written personally?
I guess I
Greg Kiesler. I'm sorry.
I guess I do. I guess 8 Perfect Murders, and I think the reason it's my favorite is because one, it was a unique book in the sense that the plot just came to me all kind of whole, which never happened. I just sort of had the idea for the story, and I pretty much instantly knew how it would play out and how it would end, and it never really changed from that initial inspiration. But mostly because it's about reading and book selling and really being a reader. And so I was able to get a lot about mysteries I love into it, what it feels like to be a reader. And I think for that reason, that's kind of my favorite.
What part of the writing process do you find most difficult personally?
It depends. I mean, sometimes writing a first draft, the scariest thing is a writer like I am, who tends to not plot out in advance. I have had a couple moments where I get halfway through a book and I'm painted myself into some sort of corner that I can't paint myself out of. And that is a very, that can be a tough thing. And because of that, I have a couple half books in my drawer that didn't make it past the midpoint. But if that's going well, I love that process. And the rewrites, you know, they can be tough too, but I don't mind that. I think it's getting stuck on a story that you like and that you kind of can't get your way out of. That can be the hardest part.
Have you ever taken one out of the drawer and got it published?
That's a good question. Sort of. I wrote Nine Lives initially was a novella that I wrote, like sort of 30,000 words, and I kind of was like, eh. And then I showed it to my agent, and he said, well, this will work, but you need to expand it. And he had some good suggestions about where to expand it, and that became sort of a drawer novel that came out. But I did pull one out the other day, and I was reading it through and wondering if I could sort of get back into it, but didn't take. I mean, there's a reason they go into the drawer usually, so
Yeah.
you hate to throw away that work, but
Maybe a few scenes can percolate out, if not the entire thing.
yeah. And you never know. Yeah, maybe you'll come back to it, but I think it's just, for me, it's just part of the process. And you know, but when it's going well, I mean, if I'm in the middle of a story and I know where it's going next and I feel decent about it, that's, you know, it's a good feeling, and I can get quite a bit of work done every day. So it's not like a draft takes me, you know, years. I'm not throwing away years of work. I can really write a draft in about 4 months if things are going well. So
Do you have any advice for young authors trying to get into writing of this particular genre?
I mean, you know, I'm sure it's the advice most people give, which is, I mean, first of all, read a ton in the genre. Don't just read the new stuff that comes along. Go back to the golden age and read, you know, go online and look at the 100 best mysteries. A couple of people have put together those lists of the 100 best mysteries, and just start picking those out and reading them. If you like the books, which you probably will, think about what about that book you liked, and if you don't like them, keep reading and then think about what you didn't like about it. And then the second thing to do is to just start writing. Don't wait for inspiration, because it might never come. Just sit down and try and crank out, you know, I try and do 1,000 words a day. Maybe you do 100 words a day. But if you do it every day, you eventually get something, and maybe you start with a short story, maybe you write a book. And don't panic if it's terrible. I mean, you know, it takes a while to get better, but I mean, that's it. That's all there is. There's no other trick. It's just, I think, reading a lot and then writing a lot, and you know, you do that, and hopefully good things will come.
Did you want to talk a little bit about your background before you became a writer, and how you got into writing in the first place?
Well, I've always been a writer in the sense that when I was a voracious reader as a kid, and I, you know, probably wrote a little book about monsters when I was 7, and my mom stapled it for me or whatever. I mean, I've always been putting together books, writing short stories, even in high school, writing poetry. So in some ways, I feel like I was always a writer. In terms of a professional writer, a published writer, and someone who makes their living off of it, I think I was around 35, and it was that age. You know, I was fairly old when I wrote my first book and finished it, and it was a whodunit that was not published. It was my 4th completed novel that was published. Again, like I just said, just keep writing, because there's probably a reason that first one didn't get published. But you know, I knew when I wrote a book. So that was a big day for me. I mean, there were 2 big days in my publishing career. One was when I got the deal that I knew my book would be published. The other day, I think, was the day I finished that first novel and got to the end. It was so exciting because I realized I could do it. I could write a novel. whether it was good or bad was besides the point at that point. It was that I had written a beginning, middle, and end, and 300 pages, and it just felt so exciting. And I realized that that was my favorite. Like, I definitely knew I wanted to be a novelist then. Like that, I prefer that, writing a big story to writing a short story or writing poetry. And, I haven't turned back. So I was very fortunate that my 4th novel was published, and I'm incredibly fortunate that my 9th novel got published 2 days ago.
It did indeed. Yay.
Yeah.
Any more, Jim?
That's
Jim?
it.
Well,
That's it.
I have a question that came up last night, which I'm now going to adopt because I think it was so very clever. I want to recommend a book to you, a debut called The Golden Spoon by Jessa Maxwell.
Oh, yeah, I met her. She, it's about food.
Well,
cooking.
it's not what you think it is. Let
Okay.
me put it that way. It really is not what you think it is. So I definitely recommend you read it. But anyway, someone in the audience asked the question of either Jessa or A.G. Riddle. I can't remember. We had them both together. So who would you, it's not really quite the New York Times question. What author would you invite out to dinner, and where would you take them? What restaurant would you take them to?
Are they dead or alive, or?
I don't know that it matters.
Okay. Well, I mean, if it's an author in history, I would go oddly with John D. MacDonald, because I loved his books growing up, his Travis McGee novels. I love them. And I would take him to, I live on the North Shore here in Massachusetts. No, I would take him to, what's it called? Keen's Chop House in New York City. I love that place. It's like a Victorian era steakhouse where you can get the only place that I know of in America where you can get a mutton chop. I think he'd appreciate that.
Wonderful. I love this question. It's so interesting. Once you get started, however, you did have a new wrinkle in it, which says that can he be dead? We were looking really at live authors because, that meant a current restaurant. But
if he's alive, I'll say Anthony Horowitz, who I have spoken to on Zoom, but not met in person. But, I would find him very entertaining to talk to, because not only does he write good mysteries, he knows his history of, you could talk mystery novels with him all night.
So it would depend on where you were. If you were in London, you might want to take him to the Ivy. If you were in New York or Boston, I'm not sure where you'd take him.
Yes, again, if I were in New York, I'll go Keen's Chop House. In Boston, I'll think of a good seafood restaurant.
Right, of which there are many. I mean, that was the key thing about Spencer's. You always had to. I love the food factor. So if you're going to write more private eye novels, you might want to think about the food factor.
I love the food factor in his books.
Right. Give Henry a restaurant.
There you go.
Perfect. A great way to end this. So thank you, Peter. Always a pleasure to speak to you. Again, let me remind you, the kind worth saving. We have autographed copies. We don't have any of the kind worth killing because it's quite a few years old, but it's still out in paperback. So you could get one of those. Anyway, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your publication week. Good night.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks, Jacob.